Are you tired of losing king and pawn endgames? In today's video, we're going to go over various different principles and techniques that are required to become proficient at these positions. Timestamps are in the description. Enjoy the video. Okay, we're gonna start off by talking about 5 key principles that you have to know in king and pawn endgames. So principle number 1 is going to be create and push passed pawns. So in this case, white has pawns on a4 and b4, black has pawns on b6 and c6. White can create a passed pawn by playing a5, and after ba5, this is a passed pawn. Black also has a passed pawn on the c file, however ours is much closer. It's 3 squares away from promotion, while this one is 5 squares away from promotion. So remember that in any king and pawn endgame, you always have to watch out for the possibility of creating passed pawns, or if you already have passed pawns, you need to make sure to utilize them and base your play around these passed pawns in order to promote them. That's going to be your goal. Make one pawn, turn one pawn into a queen, then you win king and pawn endgames. The second principle is going to be the active king. You want your king to be as active as possible, closer to the center most of the times. The king is most active in the center of the board majority of the time. There are some exceptions though, but in this case the white king is on d3 and the black king is on g8. The material is equal, however white is winning simply because white can go king c4, king b5, king a6, and then win this pawn on a7, win every other pawn, and then once again create a passed pawn and win the game. This will be the simple plan that white employs, and this is just a winning position because you're just going to push your pawns. You can go b4, a4, create a passed pawn and win the game. Principle number 3 is going to be king in front of the pawns. So in this position, white is winning, but white is winning if and only if he plays this move king to e5. And if you push this pawn to e5 instead of the king, the position immediately becomes a draw because of the thing that we're going to talk about later in the video, which is the opposition. But for right now, a principle that I want you guys to remember is that whenever you're in king and pawn endgames, the king needs to go in front. The king is the one that needs to lead the charge, and not to d5 in this case. That also leads to a draw, but king e5. We successfully put the black king in opposition and we are going to win the game. So remember, king belongs in front of the pawns. Principle number 4 is going to be to use decoys. So in this position, as you can see, white has 2 on 1 on the queen side, black has 4 on 3 on the king side. So black has the possibility of creating a passed pawn on this side of the board. White has a possibility of creating a passed pawn on this side of the board. However, it is much easier for white to create a passed pawn just because 2 pawns are much easier to move than 4 pawns. It takes much less time. So in this position, what white can play is this move a4. After ba4, the black king is forced to move closer to this pawn in order to try to stop it. And because of that, what we can do is move over here. If the black king goes over here and captures the pawn on a4, we can just start by winning all of these pawns. So notice that we use this pawn as a decoy in order to get a great position. In order for our king to get over here, this black king had to move, and that was the purpose of this pawn, to make this king move out of the way so our king could get in. So we use this pawn as a decoy, and in this case it doesn't even matter if black plays a move like f6, for example. We can just simply push this pawn to f4. Let's say the king goes to b4 in order to stop this pawn once again. Now we can still go over this way and we are still going to be able to win all of these pawns. It doesn't matter if they're pushed, the king is still going to get in. So make sure you guys use pawns. Let me go back really quickly and make sure you guys use pawns as decoys. And principle number 5 is going to be the outside passed pawn is more valuable than the central passed pawn. So you guys always need to pay attention to this. In this position, the material is equal. Both sides have G and H pawns. White has a passed A pawn, black has a passed C pawn. this position is completely winning for the white pieces because white has the further outside passed pawn, because this pawn is closer to the center than the a pawn. So in this case, let's say the white king plays king to d3 or something in order to get close over here to c4. Let's say black plays king to d5. We push the pawn, black pushes the pawn, but it does not matter because after a while, both sides are just simply going to exchange these pawns. And now what I want you to notice is that the white king is closer to this side of the board. The white king can access these two pawns much faster than the black king can access these pawns. So because of that reason, let's say both sides just go over to the other side in order to win the pawns. But the thing is, white is simply much faster, and even if you defend the pawns, it doesn't really matter. The white king is still going to win all of these pawns and then later on win the game just like this. So remember, outside passed pawns are more valuable than the central passed pawns when you're in an endgame. The next topic that we're going to discuss is the rule of the square. So white has a pawn on h4, which is 1, 2, 3, 4 squares away from promotion. So now what I want you guys to do is count 4 squares to the left. That is 1, 2, 3, and 4. And what this does is that it creates a square just like the one that you see on the screen right now. If the black king is able to step into this square, then the position is a draw because the black king is able to catch the pawn. However, in this case, it is white to move and the black king is simply unable to step in. So let's say we play this move h5 in this position. Now there's a new square that is being created. We need to count 3 squares to the top and then 3 squares to the left. And just like that, we are able to create a square just like this. And now black either has to come closer, but it doesn't matter where black goes, it is still unable to step into this square. The king goes to d5, let's say, the square still exists on the board and the king has not stepped in. We push this pawn to h6, the king gets closer, it's still not in the square. And this is the rule of the square. If the king is outside of it, the position is winning for the side that has the passed pawn, because the king is outside of the square, the king cannot catch the passed pawn. However, if we were to waste even a single move, let's say king to d2, now the position is a draw because it is black to move and black is able to go king to d5 and black has successfully stepped into the square. Let's say we push h5, we can go forward. The black is in the square. h6, king to f7, the black is still in the square, and after a couple of moves, black is able to capture the pawn and the position is a draw. Now let's discuss the position that you see on the screen right now. So the white king is on b3 and the pawns are on b4 and a3. For now, let's ignore this side of the board. Let's focus over here. Now what you guys need to remember is that when there are connected passed pawns just like this, one of them is advanced and the other one is hanging back. In a king and pawn endgame, king is unable to capture this pawn on b4. Then there is simply no way to stop the other pawn and your opponent will queen. So you cannot capture this pawn on b4 because the a pawn will simply go and promote. Now let's take a look at these two pawns on f5 and h5, which are 1 square apart. Can black win these pawns? And the answer is no. Well, first of all, it depends. If the pawn is pushed, then this is losing because the black king will go to h7, let's say. You will push the pawn, black king will capture, and then black king will simply catch this pawn. However, if we hang back and just go king to a2, let's say that the black king goes to f7 in order to win this pawn. Now we can play this move h6. And this is very important because, as we said, this pawn on f5 cannot be captured because this pawn goes. These are not the two connected passed pawns. These are split apart by 1 square. However, the rule still applies. If you take the pawn that is back here, you are unable to make it back to the square. So let's say here, we take the pawn and now white is winning. So you cannot take the pawn in this case and the position is simply a draw. Now let's look at a situation when the pawns are split by two squares. So in this case, white is winning because of how far advanced these two pawns are. Let's say in this position we were to play this pawn to h6. There's nothing that black can do. If black goes over here, we simply advance the pawn to e6, black captures on h6, and the position is simply winning because this pawn is able to promote. The king is outside of the square, therefore it cannot catch the pawn. However, if we were to change the position a little bit, so I want you guys to remember this position. Now I'm going to move to a different chapter. All I did was just change the positioning of the pawns and the king, just to illustrate once again. Now these pawns are back here on the 4th rank. The king is a little bit closer. Now black is simply winning because the black king is able to stop both of these pawns. And in this case, if we were to play a move like h5, let's say king to g5, e5 captures on h5, and after e6, this is the square right here, and the black king is simply able to step into this square. Therefore, it is able to catch the pawn, which is going to be winning because now black has the two connected passers. So I hope you guys understand how the rule of the square works. Okay, now I'm going to talk about possibly the most important concept in king and pawn endgames, and that is the opposition. So what is the opposition? Opposition is when two kings are facing each other just like this. The opposition can be done by one square, it can be done with 3 squares, or it can even be done 5 squares away when the kings are facing each other 5 squares away pretty much. If it's only 1 square, it's called the regular opposition. If it's 3 or 5 squares, it is called the distant opposition, and then we will talk about that later on in the video. But for right now, let's focus on just the regular opposition. So right now, how do we determine which side has the opposition? Now, in this case, it is black to move, so white is the one that has the opposition. And that is because when black moves, the white can actually move in the opposite direction, and this is called outflanking, because you want to go on the other flank than this king right here. This king went to e5, and you want to go to the other side. You want to go to the c4 square. You do not want to go to e3. That's just not going to lead anywhere. The correct winning technique is to go to c4. And let's say you're playing this position from the black side. Opposition determines whether your opponent's king can outflank you or not. If the white king can outflank the black king, that means that white has the opposition and white is winning. So what that would look like in this case is, let's say the king goes to c5. You want to, as we said, you want to outflank the enemy king. You want to go in the opposite direction, so you would go to e4. The black king, if it goes forward, you just push the pawn, and this is an easy win because you just walk up, or you push the pawn here, and then once again you have the opposition, and you will simply win the game, because once the king gets to c7, it is just a red carpet. Pawn just goes d6, d7, d8. It is an easy win. So that is how these positions are won. Now, if you're the side that's trying to defend, so let me just switch to this chapter right here and also flip the board. Now, let's say black has the opposition because it is white to move. How does black draw this position? Now, if white wants to go in the opposite direction of you, let's say like king to c3, and if we were to play king c5, this is a huge mistake. White is in the opposite direction of the black's king, therefore white is able to outflank the black king, and this is winning. However, because black has the opposition in this case, black does not have to go in the opposite direction. Black can go in the same direction as the white king, so the black can go to c5. And remember earlier we talked about the fact that king needs to be in front of the pawns. Well, in this case there's no way to make progress, because if you just go back and forth, that's not doing anything. Both sides can just go back and forth. But if you push the pawn, now the king is no longer in front of the pawn, and the pawn is the one that leads the charge, and this is not what will win you the game. So the easiest way to draw this position with the black pieces is to just simply keep going back and forth. Don't even go to the side, just go back and forth. Even though like king c6 is also winning here, and king e6 is also winning, the easiest technique is to just simply go back and forth. If the king stays on the third rank, you just keep going back and forth. The position will simply repeat. However, as soon as the white king moves forward, as I said earlier, you want to follow the king. You want to go in the same direction if you're trying to draw this position. You go in the opposite direction, now you lose because white king outflanks you. But you can go to c6 and just simply disallow that. And now, once again, white, in order to make progress, will simply have to push the pawn. Otherwise, if the white pieces go back, once again, you move back and forth. So what will happen is that we will rinse and repeat this process. We go in the same direction as the king, we rinse and repeat, we rinse and repeat, and we get to a scenario like this where white is simply unable to make progress. And if white pushes the pawn, we simply, once again, we go in front of it. And now what happens is that if the king steps away from the pawn, we just simply capture it. But if the king goes to d6, now it is a stalemate because black king has no legal moves. So this is how opposition works. Just to recap everything that I just said, if you're the side, let me just go back, there we go. If it is white to move in this position, that means that black has the opposition and black can go on the same side as the white king and draw the game. If white has the opposition, then black has to move out of the way and you outflank the king, and now the position is simply winning. So I hope this was clear, because opposition is sort of a difficult concept to explain. So what I would suggest is that you guys practice this as much as possible. The link to the study is going to be in the description, so you can just check this position out in this study and see what you guys can figure out on your own. But make sure to practice this endgame. Opposition does not necessarily have to be vertical, it can be horizontal or diagonal as well. So for example, in this position, in order to take opposition, white plays king to e4, now it is black to move. Let's say black goes over here to this side of the board, let's say black goes king d6. We cannot follow the king with king d4 because the pawn on c5 is preventing that. However, we can go king to f4, and now we have the diagonal opposition. If the king goes to d5, now we go to f5. The important thing here is that we are also using this pawn in order to restrict the king, but we are also opposing this king horizontally and once again diagonally as well. So we are basically not allowing this king to move forward. Actually, if the king ventures too far to the right, we can pick up the pawn, but we just keep following the king. We just keep following the king just like this, and we can get diagonal and even horizontal oppositions just like that. Okay, now I want to show you guys a practical example of the concept that I was talking about earlier. Now in this position, you have two ways to go. You can either go king to c5 or you can go king to e5. Now if you guys want to, you can pause the video and figure out all the nuances of this position yourself and figure out which move is correct. Now, for those of you who just simply want to know the answer, the correct move in this position is king to e5, putting the king in opposition. Now, what happens if instead we play the more natural move, which is king to c5, trying to go to b6? The problem is that the king that is on e7 will go to d7, king b6, king c8, and now black is simply defending everything. We can try moves like c4, we can even try b5, but it's just simply not going to do anything because after a couple of captures, all the pawns are being swapped off, and this does not really give us anything. So going back, the correct move, as I mentioned earlier, is to go to e5 instead, and this puts the black king in opposition. If the king goes to f7, now we can go to d6 and then go to c7 and pick up this pawn on b7. If the king instead chooses to go to d7, now we can walk all the way over to h7, and there's nothing that our opponent can do. We're simply going to be winning this pawn on h7. Even if the king traps us here, we can just simply drop back to h6, and then black king has to move away. We capture the pawn. If he sacrifices the pawns, well, okay, now we have a couple of free pawns. So make sure you guys always get the opposition in king and pawn endgames. Okay, now I want to show you a couple of different scenarios that are either always winning or sometimes not very winning at all. So in this position, as you can see, we have the king on c4, but we don't have the pawn on c3 as the white pieces. We have a pawn on c2. Whenever there is one square or even more squares separating the pawn and the king, these positions are always going to be winning. Why? Because we can always take the opposition. Now in this case, if it was black to move, let's say the black king would go to d6, you would simply outflank with king to b5 and then continue pushing the pawn, and that is an easy win. That is something that we already discussed. But in this case, it is white to move, but the pawn is not on c3, it is on c2. So what we can do here is waste the tempo. Well, it's not technically not a waste, we're just moving the pawn, and now once again we give the move back to our opponent, and it is black's move. Black has to move to the side. Now we have the opposition. When there's one or more squares between the pawn and the king, it is always going to be winning because we can always waste the tempo. We can always move the pawn to get the opposition. So make sure whenever you get into a scenario like this, you get the opposition. Now let me show you another scenario that is always winning, and it is a position like this. So the pawn is on the 5th rank, the king is on the 6th rank, and the pawn has not been advanced to the 6th rank. And these positions, despite the fact that it is white to move and black is the one that's supposed to have the opposition here, whenever the king and the pawn are this far advanced and the king is in front of the pawn, it's always going to be winning, even though it is white to move. So in this case, we would just simply move out of the way. The black king follows us to try to defend, but it doesn't matter because we have two pawn moves. We have two tempes, therefore we are able to force the king out over here, take the d7 square and promote on the next move. So let me just go back to show you the beginning position. This is the beginning position and this is always winning. But if we move all of the pieces one square down, just like this position right here, now once again this is just a normal situation where black has the opposition because it's white to move, and the position is simply a draw because the black king will follow, and it's basically the same exact technique that we talked about, but in this case, as you can see, the king is not in front of the pawn. If the pawn was back here on c5, this king in this position, if this pawn was back here on c5, this would be winning because the king would go to c6 and the position is just turns into this one right here. But the thing is, from this position we simply cannot achieve that, and therefore it is a draw. But if the king is this far advanced with the pawn on the 5th rank, it is always going to be winning. Let me show you another scenario, one more scenario. When there are multiple pawns on the board and we have an extra pawn here, the opposition does not really matter as much, because even if king follows us and he just tries to get the regular opposition just like this, it doesn't matter because we will use the pawn as a decoy and then we will go and pick up the rest of the pawns over here. So there's simply no need to panic or anything like that. We just simply push the pawn and then we win the other pawn, we win the game. So when there are multiple pawns on the board, we can easily win the game and the opposition does not really matter. As I mentioned earlier, opposition doesn't only have to be one square apart, opposition can be 3 or 5 squares apart as well. So in this case, there is only one move that wins the game for the white pieces, and that is the move king to e2. So what we're doing right now is we're taking the distant opposition, we are stepping 5 squares away from this king on e8. And what we need to do is that if this king comes closer, let's say the king goes to d7, we want to follow this king to d3. If the king goes to f7, we want to follow it to f3. So that is the general plan. If we go to d3 here, this is not going to work. This is going to be a draw. But what we need to do is we need to keep following the king and turn distant opposition into regular opposition. Once both kings get to the center of the board, now I want you to notice that this distant opposition has turned into a regular opposition. And after a move like king to f6, let's say king to f4 is played, and after a while we can get one of these pawns, because if the king goes to g5 in this case, we can even go king to e5, and then now the king can no longer go down. But if the king tries to go over here in order to grab this pawn, the problem is the white king is simply much faster. Distant opposition is a very, very rare concept in chess. I haven't actually had the chance to use this myself in an actual game, despite playing chess for years now, but it is a concept that exists, and it is a pretty cool concept. The regular opposition in chess is very common. The distant opposition is not so common, but it is still cool to see. Now I want to talk about a couple of theoretical situations when the pawn is a rook's pawn. So if white has an A or an H pawn, these rules apply to these sorts of positions. So whenever we have one of these two pawns, A or H, it doesn't matter which side has the opposition as long as your opponent's king can get to the corner or the promotion square. Now the problem here is that once the king gets to A8, there is no way to win this position, and in this case there is simply no way to stop the king from getting to that square. We can play a move like king to b8. The black king can sit around and wait over here, but also like he can just run to the corner and there's nothing that can be done here. The black king will simply go back and forth, and there is no way to win this position. If we push the pawn to a7, this is going to be a stalemate. If we put the king here, the king is just going to go back and forth, and if we go far away, I mean, it just nothing's going to work. The position is a draw. So there's one more technique that I want to show you, and it is very helpful in a scenario like this, or a slightly different case than this, and it is this position right here. So the technique that I want to teach you guys is called the shouldering, and the shouldering is basically not allowing the opponent's king to cross a certain file or a certain rank. So in this case, we want to play this move king to b3 because we know that if the king gets to the corner of the board, this position is going to be a draw. So what we want to do is, instead of pushing this pawn and allowing the king to just simply run to the corner, we want to shoulder the king away from the corner. Our king on b4 is stopping this king on d4. Black king tries to go up, we still don't push. Remember, we need to prioritize shouldering this king, and we need to prioritize disallowing this king from getting to the corner. And in this case, it's getting to the corner, but shouldering can be in other cases as well. It can happen in many different scenarios, as long as you don't allow your opponent's king to get to a certain square where they can draw the position. So the main move here in this position is king to b5, and even after king d6, we keep going up, and even after king d7, we still don't want to push because the king goes over here, and this position is still a draw, just like this, because the black king will simply go back and forth, and there is no way to win this position because now the king is simply trapped in the corner, and after king to c7, the position is a stalemate. So that is why we need to continue shouldering the king, and we need to go to b7. And only now we can start pushing this pawn. The king doesn't have anywhere else to go. Let's say king goes to d6. King d8 doesn't matter because the king is not going to walk off the edge of the board and somehow magically teleport to a8. But the king can try to go to d6. The problem is it simply does not matter because we can just push this pawn and win the game. So remember to shoulder the king away from important squares. There is one more example of outflanking that I want to show you guys, and this is the reason why this concept is so important, this position right here. So after king to c2, let's say black plays king e7, king b3, and king a4. Now white has a decision to make. White can either go to a4 or white can go to c4. Going to c4 is actually a huge mistake, and it blunders a draw because after king to c4, black has king c6, and black is the one with the opposition. However, if instead we choose to outflank the black king and go to the opposite side, then instead we are able to take the opposition after a couple of moves. After king b7, we go king b5, and now we get this position where white is the one with the opposition, and white is going to win this game. Now, a fun fact fact about outflanking is that it is a concept that is most common in king and pawn endgames. However, it is actually not exclusive to king and pawn endgames. Most players actually don't know this, but outflanking is a technique that you can use in rook endgames as well, if it's like king, rook, and a pawn versus king and a rook, but those cases are very, very rare. Most commonly, it happens in king and pawn endgames, but it is not exclusive to king and pawn endgames. The next concept that I'm going to teach you guys is called the triangulation, and the purpose of triangulation is to achieve the same position that you have on the board, but with your opponent to move. So in this case, it is white to move. However, if this position was black to move, black would move somewhere else. Let's say the black king would go to d7, we would easily be able to push this pawn to f6 and win the game. So in order for us to actually make progress in this position, we need to get that position. And the way we do that is we need to create a small triangle. We go king to e4. Let's say the black king comes to f6. Now we go king f4. The king goes back, and now we go king back to e5, and we have achieved the exact same position. However, right now it is black to move. After black moves to d7, let's say, now we go f6, and this is an easily winning position. We are going to queen on the next move. Same thing would happen if the king went to f8 instead of f6. Let's say the king goes back here, we go king d5. We don't go back right away, but we want to triangulate. We want to waste the tempo, and when the king comes back, now we want to go to e5, achieving the same position in the beginning, but with our opponent to play. And from here, the process would be the same. There are many different ways to triangulate your position, and it is once again not exclusive to king and pawn endgames. It can happen in queen endgames as well. It can probably happen in rook endgames. I can't exactly recall a scenario right now, but I can definitely recall a scenario where you need to triangulate your queen in queen versus rook endgames especially. So that is what I wanted to talk about. Make sure you guys triangulate the position in order to get the opposition. So in this case, that is what we did. We got the opposition, forced the king to move out of the way, and then promoted the queen. Okay, now let's talk about a concept called poison squares. And poison squares are the type of squares in chess where if you step into them, you are going to lose the game. So in this position, the poison squares for white are this square on f5, and for black, it's this square on d4. The thing is, a move like king to f5 might look very natural because you're attacking the pawn, right? You know, what can be wrong here? If the king goes to d6, you will simply go over here, and actually it's not winning because the black king gets the opposition, but you win the pawn. So what is the issue? And actually this position is winning for the black pieces if black goes to d4 now, at the moment when white goes to f5. And the thing is, white king has to move away, and it cannot move away and defend the pawn at the same time. Let's say the king goes here, you take the pawn as the black pieces. If the white king could go to e2 right now, this position would be a draw, but white king cannot do that, so this position is simply winning. So going back, it actually works both ways. If you go to g5 and the black king goes over here to the poison square, now you go to f5, and there's no way for black to defend this pawn on e5, and therefore white is winning. And this works from the other side as well. So in this case, it was pawns on e5 and e4. But if we take the position from here, this can apply to a situation where the pawns are on d4 and e4. Now, the thing about this position is that even though you step into the poison pawns, it is still a draw, because despite you losing the pawn on e4, you can actually go king e2 and get the opposition. That is the only reason why this position is a draw. If your king goes over here, now it's winning. If the king goes over here, it's still a draw because this position is still a draw. However, if you change the position a little bit and you add some other pawns to the position, so let me just go back to the beginning. We have the same scenario over here, but there are multiple pawns on the board. And in this case, if we were to play a move like king to c3 and black were to play a move like king to b4, or king to b5, defending this pawn. Now, who is winning and why? The side that is going to be winning here is the side that puts their opponent in Zugzwang. Zugzwang is a situation in chess where any move that you make makes your position worse in one way or another. So in this case, the correct and the winning move is this move g4. I think other moves are winning. I'm pretty sure g3 is winning as well, but the most principled way to win is to go g4 and control these two pawn pushes specifically. Let's say your opponent goes g6, you want to go h4, h6, h5, and after a couple of moves, Black has finally run out of moves and Black is in Zugzwang here. If Black plays f5, he loses the pawn. If Black moves the king, he relinquishes the control of this pawn. And in this case, the position is completely winning for the white pieces because there's extra pawns on the board. If there were no other pawns, like imagine this side of the board was completely empty, the king would go to c6 and the position would be a draw because Black king would have the opposition. But as we talked about earlier, you don't need opposition when there are other pawns on the board. So this position is simply completely winning for the white pieces. So that's what you need to keep in mind. Whenever you're in scenarios like this, do not step into the poisoned squares. So that's going to be it for today's episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it and check out some of my other endgame videos in order to get your endgame skills to the next level. See you guys in the next video and peace.